welcome. Thank you for coming out today. I actually know it's an incredibly busy time of the year for a lot of people, so I really appreciate that you took time out of your busy schedule to be here today. And I'm quite excited about today because Cheryl Strauss Einhorn is a very, very dear friend of mine. We go back, probably 18 years, and our youngest, who met each other when they were 2 years old, are off to college together, and they ended up at the same college. And they haven't seen each other for like 16 years probably, right? So that's really, really exciting. And I'm really excited to be speaking with her and with all of you about her book, Problem Solved. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro to Cheryl, because she's a quite accomplished lady, and I'm going to make the intro a little bit shorter, because if I would just speak about all her accomplishments, we would be an hour further, and I don't want to do that to you. So Cheryl right now has her own company, and her company is CSE Consulting, and she focuses, of course, on decision making, which is what her book is all about. And before that, Cheryl spent about a decade working for the business magazine Barron's, and she was a copywriter and an editor, and at that time she also appeared almost daily, or actually daily, live on air at CNBC, speaking about the analysis of the future markets. So after that, she became a television producer for News Edition. Is it News Edition? Yeah, Inside Edition. Sorry, Cheryl. And she covered investigative stories for consumers and for on social issues. Then she started her own company, and right now, besides having her own company, she's an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School, as well as the School of Journalism. So she is also a freelance writer. In the last month, I think she wrote for Forbes, Fortune. She actually wrote for the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and she wrote for the Council on Foreign Relations, and actually many more. So Cheryl also has won some journalistic awards. So really, we're in good hands with her, as you can tell. And I'm really excited to be speaking about you today, Cheryl, and with all of you about this book. And one of the things that I love the most about this book, is not the most, but what I really like, is the title, Problem Solved. And as a Dutch person, I tend to be quite direct, as people say, and I love that title because it's so clear, it's direct, it exudes confidence, and I also think it exudes comfort. And I'm going to tell you we're in good hands with Cheryl. And what I think is really important about this book, it's so timely, and if we're thinking about solving problems, if actually we had a better and more effective way of solving our problems, we would actually be in a much better place in our personal life, in our career, and our companies, and the nation, and the world would actually be run more effectively along clear values. So this is the intro. One day, when I was a young girl, my mother went out and got her makeup done at a local department store makeup counter. When she returned, she asked my father how she looked. He replied, "Dear, when I look at you, I see my fantasy, not the makeup you wear." Dear, wouldn't we all want She wondered aloud, and this is her mom. Her mom wondered aloud if that meant he didn't really look at her. Even as a little girl, Cheryl realized that it meant he saw her perfectly. My mother was always the practical one, and I know Cheryl's mother, and I know this to be true, who kept a set of encyclopedias in the car so we could read and learn even en route to the grocery store. My father's been the dreamer who saw and asked questions nobody else did. This book is dedicated to both of my parents who have taught me my different ways of seeing. You, Cheryl, your book, Problem Solved, discusses the area method. And so my question is, can you just tell the audience a little bit about what area stands for and how area the area methods came about.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for coming out this morning. I'm really looking forward to talking about my book. So the genesis of my area method is that I spent a decade as an editor and columnist at Barron's, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a business and financial publication, and I sort of specialized in what you might call the bearish company story. And those were stories that would take a skeptical look at a company's accounting or at their strategy. And when these stories came out, a lot of times there was a big share price reaction. Sometimes the regulators would get involved or the Justice Department. And I became concerned about the human toll of these stories, not just the economic impact on somebody's portfolio or on their retirement account, but on somebody's ability to actually go to work at these companies, or if you were a customer of the diabetic test kits that a company like Polymedica was selling when they were raided by the FBI, what happened if that was a product that you relied upon? And so I became concerned, is there a way that I could have better confidence and conviction in the decisions that I'm making? And how can I also better understand the incentives and the motives of the sources who came to me with those stories? And at the same time, researchers were just beginning to tell us that we all are flawed thinkers, that we come into our day with our assumptions, our biases, and our judgments, and we need those so that when we go into the supermarket, we're not overwhelmed in the cereal aisle. We remember what we like, we can pull it off the shelf, we can get on with our day. But those same mental shortcuts, they don't go away when we're solving for complex problems. So we need a way to sort of pry open cognitive space so we can allow for new information and new insights to take hold. And so that's, given my background as a researcher, that's how I started to think about maybe I could just go all in on my mental flaws, because we can't really ever sort of have a beginner's mind. We can't say we're objective and then all of a sudden we're objective. It just doesn't work that way. But I started to think about, is there a way that I could design a system that acknowledges the mental shortcuts that we have and that works within that framework? And so that's how I initially came up with AREA, which is a perspective-taking process. The letters A, R, E, and A are each acronyms for the progression of the decision-making system. So A is absolute information from the target of your decision. The R is the next concentric circle of information. It's relative sources, secondary or tertiary sources somehow connected to the target of your decision. The E is actually two E's, and I refer to them as the twin engines of creativity. Area exploration is about getting beyond document-based sources to identify the individuals and interview those people who have information that could help you with your decision. And then area exploitation turns its lens inward on us as decision makers to help us assess our assumptions against our evidence. And then area A analysis cobbles the system back together to help you to think about how to come to conviction on your decision.
So I love that you're saying that, Cheryl. I also love how Cheryl looks at the individual and how the individual plays such an important component in this decision-making process. So Tony Blair wrote your foreword and talking about, impressive individuals. Tell us a little bit what his perspective is on your book and the area methods.
So what he said to me is that you need a decision-making system before you need a system, right? I mean, we're all brought up to be decision makers, and yet somehow there's no well-established way to make complex decisions well. And yet we know that into our lives come at least a dozen of these, personally and professionally, that impact our families and our ability to really develop a meaningful life. So he says that the area method and the book is almost like taking a vitamin or those shots that you get when you're a kid. You read the book the whole way through, and then you basically know when you're faced with a high-stakes decision that you have a process that you're ready. Because essentially there's two kinds of learning, right? There's knowledge and there's skill. And what's nice about the area method is it's a skill. I can teach it to you, and then it can become yours. And you can use it however it resonates for you.
Sorry, being British, I just need to ask, or half British, how did you get, why Tony Blair You know, how did you get him to write
So
your
good
foreword? How
question,
did you know
I love
him?
that.
So I met him years ago, originally through his Faith Foundation, which tries to sort of build a more tolerant and pluralistic world between people of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. And then I started to do some work with him around speeches and different business opportunities. And one day he said, well, what's new with you? Because we usually talk about him. And I said, well, I've just written a book and I'm trying to get it published. And he said, well, what is it about? And I said, complex decision making. And he said, well, Cheryl, I know something about complex decision making. And so I sent it. He asked me to send him a copy. You know, it was just a Word PDF, and he read it, and he called me 2 weeks later. He said, I love this, and I'm going to write your foreword.
So, you know, during your career as an investigative journalist, and also while you were teaching in Columbia, at what point did you actually realize that this tool actually could be incredibly helpful for many other people, clients and students, entrepreneurs, and what?
Well, originally, as I was saying, I developed this to do a more ethical and a more holistic job. And what I found is the perspective taking has become an operating system for me. That's really what the area method has become. It's not just a decision-making system, it's sort of the way that I am showing up, because perspective taking not only gives you the ability to develop better empathy and understanding with the other stakeholders involved in your decision, it actually has a mirroring effect, and that gives you a 2-for-1, which means you're not only understanding where other people are coming from, but it also helps you to bubble up those mental shortcuts, those assumptions, biases, and judgments that we all just have based on who we are, right? So that was really, for me, something that became a way that as I'm talking to people, I find I'm a much more active listener, because the more that I'm trying to understand the other person's incentives and motives, the more that I'm actually able to be relational and to also solve problems holistically, and therefore that gives them a better chance of succeeding. Because I'm not just solving it from my perspective, I'm solving it so that I'm bringing everybody else to the table who needs to be a participant in that decision. And so, you know, originally I was just using it for myself, and then at Columbia, first at the Graduate School of Journalism, where I was teaching courses in business, economic, and financial journalism, and then at the business school where I teach advanced investment research, I started realizing that it's really nice to have interesting conversations with the students and to give them good activities and homework to do, but we all need a little bit of cognitive space ourselves. We need to go home with something and be able to sort of think about it on our own time. And I realized that it really would make sense to give the students a textbook that they could take home with them. So right around 2012, I actually wrote up my area method into a textbook that I began teaching with. And I taught with it for several years at both schools. And then slowly individuals and companies started saying, I hear you have a decision-making system. I'm just getting my company off the ground. I have a million decisions that I have to make all at the same time. Can you help me with this? Or I'm at the point where I'm really ready to grow my business, or I'm having, you know, an HR problem. And can you step in? So that's how I really started using it for other people. And then about 2 summers ago, I was having lots of friends who were having their kids getting ready to think about the college application process, or another very popular problem, unfortunately, is how do we help our parents find the right living accommodations so that they can age in place where they can also get the kind of continuous care that they need. And so I started just looking on Amazon to see what was out there, and I realized there's nothing for you and me. But we all deserve something that is accessible and flexible, and that we can make our own, so that we have a system ourselves that gives us an opportunity to make complex decisions.
So it seems that you give a framework. You don't actually, as a consultant, say, this is the best decision. You give a framework for them to come to the conclusion. I'd be interested to know just an example of even, you know, a small type problem, like the framework that you would give somebody to make a good decision.
So I would be happy to do that. The book goes through 4 different high-stakes decisions, and the term high stakes, I define that as something that is going to have a long-term outcome, where the outcome is unknown, and the price for getting it wrong can be very costly. So one decision, since all of you are entrepreneurs, is I follow the story of John. He is actually the founder of a charity that is based in Nepal that provides basic health care to people. And he happened to come to me because a former student of mine sent him my textbook in Nepal as he was getting ready to expand his charity. So think of it like expanding your business. And he came to meet me in the halls at Columbia Business School, and 2 days later, the devastating earthquake hit Nepal that killed over 10,000 people. And all of a sudden, he needed this plan yesterday. And he also was going to have this interesting structural advantage, which is for this moment in time, all of the world's major healthcare charities were going to be on the tarmac in Kathmandu. And he was going to have one opportunity to say, vertically integrate with me. Here's my comprehensive plan. Here's why it's going to succeed. And so we really had to put him through the process under a very time-constrained situation. And so in his absolute, he was looking at 3 different options based on his situation in Nepal. One was right in his core competency. He was thinking about basically expanding to open a second healthcare clinic in a much busier area. The second option was to partner with the government and to work through their network of clinics, which would take him from being a direct service organization to being the trainer organization. But the government of Nepal had a very spotty reputation. And so that would have been a concern to him. And his third option was actually to use drones, because there's such treacherous terrain in Nepal, to drop and deliver medical test kits, to get people more, the medical test kits in a far more dispersed way. But then, of course, you'd have to wonder about how would the care be delivered. So in his area absolute, in framing his decision from the target of his decision-making system, he actually looked at information from the Nepalese government itself. What does it say about the population data, where he was thinking about the second clinic? What did it say about what type of ailments and healthcare problems there were in the region he was thinking about opening up, in the regions where the government had its own clinics, in the regions where he might be delivering the drone systems, for instance? And initially, especially if any of you have ever worked in emerging markets, you know that a lot of times there's not a lot of information, or the information can be very unreliable from these places. So initially he was really thinking, I'm not going to be able to find anything, but what I recommend to people is, generally speaking, there are numbers related to the decisions that you're making. And while not all decisions should necessarily be made by the numbers, you should have a basic idea of what numbers are provided and develop your own internal compass about them before you read about, let's say, what the company has to say about its numbers, or how the country puts a conceptual framework on it, so that you yourself are continually along the process, always beginning to build your own sense of confidence in how you are a reasonable person and able to interpret data and information. In the R relative phase, he then talked to other healthcare charities that did work either in emerging nations or had done work after natural disasters, to see if the different options that he was looking at, he could basically look at organizations that were a little bit ahead of him that he could learn from, and he did a literature review that also gave him information about what other types of assistance he might be able to have from other organizations. In area exploration, he was able to talk to people from other healthcare charities who had done work not only in Nepal, but maybe had done work in other countries, to talk about the perils and the potential upsides of each of the options. In area exploitation, when he actually began to look at his assumptions against his evidence, he did an exercise that I discuss in the book. And I discuss in area exploitation exercises that I've learned from other disciplines like investigative journalism and medicine and the intelligence community. And he realized that although he had collected a lot of information early on, sometimes we don't recognize its import until later on. And what he recognized when he looked at his assumptions against his evidence was that although he really thought he would open a second clinic because it was in his core competency, he had not closely understood that not only was the population far more vast than anything he could potentially resource, but that he also would be dealing with completely different maladies, and that he could really end up bankrupting his charity if he opened the second clinic. And so these exercises really saved him and worked as a feedback loop to drive him back into earlier parts of the process, because sometimes we need more data or more analysis. Not all investigations are linear, nor should they be. And it really empowered him to go back and look at how is it that he might be able to partner with the government with this problematic reputation that it had and still reach a good outcome. He had to drop the drone alternative because you need constant internet connectivity, and in a country like Nepal, that just wasn't feasible at the time and still is not feasible today. So when he got to his area analysis part of the process, he did an exercise that is called a pre-mortem, which is the opposite of a post-mortem. A post-mortem is what you do after the patient has died, but a pre-mortem says, think about your decision failing. Tell the story of that failure, and then you are able to potentially set up signposts that not only would tell you that the decision is failing, but be able to set up markers for how to prevent failure from occurring in that way. So by the time we got to the end of his process, not only did he come to a very unexpected outcome and save himself from what would potentially have bankrupted his charity, he also was able to tell the story of why it should succeed, had set up safeguards to prevent it from failure, and in the very few weeks that I quickly took him through the process, he raised more money than he had raised in the entire history of his charity, and the plan has been unfolding beautifully for him. Not all area investigations have this kind of success, but what you're essentially doing with area is, instead of focusing on the complex problem that you have, which I think is very scary for all of us, to basically face down a big problem, it inverts decision making, and it asks you what I think is a far more empowering question. It says, what does success look like for you personally? That's a question that most of us can answer. And therefore, you're telling the story of that success, and you're laying down the pathway toward it. You're not conducting an open-ended research process. This is not about complete optionality. This is about deeply and creatively identifying what I call your critical concepts, the 1, 2, or 3 things that really matter to you in the outcome, that get you to your vision of success, so that you can be able to come to a decision that you know is going to succeed.
And one of the things that Cheryl speaks about in her book is the cheetah and the cheetah pauses. And I would love for you to kind of explain that a little bit to the audience, because I think we tend to make decisions very quickly, and which can be good, and sometimes it's not so good. So I would love for you to speak a little bit about that.
Terrific. So basically what AREA does is it updates the research and pedagogy related to decision making in 4 ways, right? The first is that it understands that research is fundamental to decision making. And right now there's no books out there that basically take you through a research process with the idea that at the end you are going to make a decision. But instead, the books generally say, do research or explore all your options as a single step. But the truth is research is an umbrella term for a whole series of tricky steps that need to be thoughtfully and carefully navigated. So AREA breaks it down so it's not a black box, and it tells you what to do at each part in the process. The second thing is the focus on the cognitive biases, which we talked about. The third thing is that AREA builds in strategic stops. And at the stops, I call them cheetah pauses, because the cheetah's prodigious hunting skill is not its ability to accelerate like a race car. It's actually that it can decelerate by up to 9 miles an hour in a single stride. And in hunting, that's more important, because that builds in agility, flexibility, and maneuverability. And that's what we need in a good research and decision-making process. We need that agility, that flexibility, and that maneuverability. So all along the process, what I do is I recommend these cheetah pauses, and every time I have a cheetah pause, I give you a cheetah sheet. And these cheetah sheets are basically the graphic organizers of the AREA method, and they serve 2 purposes. They either tell you where do you look for information in this part of the process that you're in, or what kind of analysis do you want to be doing now, so that I am holding your hand all the way through. Because as we all know, life is incredibly busy, and in this technology-driven age, especially with texting and answering emails late at night, we feel like we've got to respond, and we constantly have to be making decisions. But the truth is when you're solving for an uncertain but important future, your own, you deserve time for thoughtful reflection. And that's what the cheetah pauses do. They say, now is the time to pause, and here's what we're going to do at this phase of the
Yes,
game.
and June.
So time is, you know,
Yep.
our biggest constraint, resource, everything. How do you time box this process? Do you recommend having a timeline for complex decision making?
So I think that's a great question, and I was talking about how Tony Blair had sort of described it as a vitamin or a shot. What I recommend to people is read the book all the way through. My target was 200 pages, you're out at 200 pages, because we're all busy. And like I said, it's filled with these cheetah sheets, so you also have something that afterwards you can pictorially find, because many of us are also visual learners, and that's really nice to know, oh yes, it was this cheetah sheet that I want, and they look different on the page. But then, based on the time constraints that you have, you can pick and choose what works for you. Anything new that you do is upping your game, is upping your rigor, and that's where the learning occurs. So you could start with any part of it that really resonates for you, and you can basically make it yours and build it out. But I think it's incredibly useful to see, soup to nuts, what does a comprehensive due diligence process look like for 2 high-stakes personal decisions and 2 high-stakes professional decisions. Because the hope is that it should be easy and accessible, so that you should be able to see yourself and understand how you can apply it through the narrative of these different stories.
Yes, Mary.
I love the examples, really help me understand what you're doing, and I would love to see something closer, a little bit of an example, something closer to home, like you mentioned about a living situation for an aging parent.
So in the story, I tell the story of Bill. And Bill's parents, they have too many stairs. They've been in the same house for so many years, and they really just need a different option. And what Bill is thinking is that, wouldn't it be nice if there was a place where there could be a continuum of care, right? Where they basically are starting in one facility, and as they need more, they don't have to move. So that's initially the option that he thinks is going to be the best for them. So in his absolute phase of research, he is basically trying to identify what are the continuous care options for his parents, and he initially identifies 7 absolute targets, right? If you're looking at, I tell the, John had 3 when he was thinking about his options in Nepal, but Bill starts off with 7. And so he initially starts his research process where most of us start today, which is on the internet. But instead of typing into Google, which is where you get every perspective at the same time, and we can't unlearn, right? So now we haven't had a chance to develop our own sea legs. He starts with each of the absolute targets individually. This is what the Osborne says, and this is what this other organization says, by going to their websites to actually see what they have to say. And very quickly he recognizes there's no pricing data, there's not a lot of transparency related to these things, but he holds himself in the absolute frame of reference and just starts with what he can collect directly from the organizations, also wondering why there is a lack of transparency and what does the difference in transparency mean for what these organizations might mean for his parents. In Our Relative, he begins to look at rankings related to the different organizations he's thinking about. He also looks at, what sort of white papers and other information could he find out about the different types of care. Some of these places, for instance, the information comes up that they actually have white papers that say that they can do testing on their residents. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that they get cutting-edge care, or does that mean potentially that they're getting too much testing, too much blood work, and other things that maybe would not be of interest to his parents? In area exploration, he goes and he visits these different places because there's nothing like getting beyond the documents. Some of the places don't look half as modern as they do on their pictures. What's the food like? What is the average day like? What are the actual pricing components that he could get? And then in area exploitation, when he starts to really look at his assumptions against his evidence, not only does he recognize for the first time that just because you get into a place doesn't mean that there's space if and when his parents needed to move on. Just because they offer the continuum of care, he hadn't realized until he looked at the assumptions against the evidence, what would happen if his parents all of a sudden needed much more care and they couldn't then move to an area that actually needed it. Well, then he'd be back to square one. And so in area analysis, when he really began to think about solvability and do the pre-mortem, he recognized that actually he wasn't going to be able to go to a place that offered a continuum of care because the continuum wasn't a logical progression. You could get stopped at these choke points. And so he actually recognized that he had to think about other living alternatives that maybe were some of these types of homes that have the master bedroom on the first floor. Had he not gone through the process though, he probably would have moved his parents into one of these places and then worried that maybe he'd have to move them again. And so he was able to come to an entirely unexpected outcome for himself, which was not only finding them a place where they could stay on their own, but that also maybe could have an extra bedroom where somebody could move in over time with them, who could provide that continuum of care instead of getting it at a facility. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, in that case study, had he not thought of that question? I don't know if you prodded him to think of that question at the end, like if his parents get into a situation, there wouldn't be a space for them. Had he not thought of that, it could have been a complete disaster. So how do you make sure that they actually, you know, discuss all the possibilities?
I think it's a great question. So one of my favorite chapters in the book is the exploration chapter, because it's all the investigative journalism work that I've been doing over the last 25 years, which is really, I developed what I call the interview formula. It's GP plus GQ equals IQ. Good prospects, the right people, plus great questions equal interview quality. And I go through what are the different types of questions. And again, I recommend this idea of inversion, which I think is simple but so powerful. It's what you're basically trying to do are say, what are the answers that I really need? And what would I do with those answers once I had them? That's an entirely different way of coming up with the right questions, right? And I don't think it necessarily, it never occurred to him, you know, that you might get a choke point in moving into one of these facilities, because they showcase soup to nuts. And for many of us, we buy it. And it's not bad that we buy it because we have other things we're thinking about and because we're constantly making assumptions and judgments about the information that we have. So this whole process of the strategic stops and prying open the cognitive space is what can really save us. And I call that exploration chapter making our mistakes before we make them, right? We can't always make our mistakes before we make them. But these kinds of exercises that look at our assumptions against our evidence, they are there to really help us to the extent that we can make our mistakes before we make them.
Just one question.
Yes.
You know, like this decision with regard to the parent, finding the aging in place solution or other business solutions. I come out of a management consulting background before real estate. What is your perspective on engaging consultants that have, navigated through that same decision with other people before?
So I think in exploration, you're reaching out to those people who may well be ahead of you, right? You're reaching out to the people who have the information that can help you with the decision. So again, you can hopefully sort of make your mistakes before you make them when you think about it, right? When John was talking to other charity organizations that were 5-10 years ahead of his organization or had already worked in sort of a disaster relief kind of situation, or for Bill, when he talked to other people who had gone through a similar process with their parents, how could he learn from them? I think that it's very much like reaching out to a management consultant in some ways. If you identify the GP, the good prospects, part of the equation. And I go through with some of the cheetah sheets early on in the exploration chapter, how do you identify your prospects for the particular kind of problem that you're thinking about? Where are some of, obviously each person individually has to be able to find the right set of people for themselves, but what are the different categories of people out there? If you're not really used to reaching out and making cold calls or interviewing people, you may not even necessarily know what some of your options are in terms of industry experts or academics or management consultants or accountants or other types of people who may well be able to shed light and to save you from some of the bad decisions that you want to be saved from, but also who can help you better think through what are some of the things that maybe haven't bubbled up yet.
In the Wall Street Journal, there was just an article about female CEOs who actually had a better, outcome. How do I say?
They were
it?
being paid more.
They were not. They were not only being paid more. They actually had better results, which that to me was the most exciting part.
And they also, the article said that they were very heavily brought in for turnaround situations.
That's right. That's right.
Instead, what you're saying is we all come from the experiences that we have. I'm a middle class kid from outside of Boston, right? That's a very limited, very nice, but very limited background, right? So I know that there's so much that I don't know. So it's not that I'm objective. It's that I know that I'm biased based on my background. And it also acknowledges we're all biased naturally by our background. This is not bad, it's natural, but we can't be having the same conversation if I'm not trying to step into your perspective and understand what makes you tick, right? What are your incentives and motives? What are you showing up to this conversation with? So that's why it is actually coming to a more holistic decision, because there's nothing higher stakes that we do than make choices. And so there is nothing that we have greater agency over. There's nothing that can lead us to a more empathetic outlook and to potentially a more meaningful life than being able to solve our high-stakes decisions holistically.
So one of the things that Cheryl quotes is Anna Nin, who says, and this goes to objectivity, subjectivity, right? She says, we don't see things the way they are. We see things the way we are, which is so powerful. And I think that understanding that we all have biases helps us in our decision making. It was Jeff Bezos of Amazon who said, most decisions should be made with only 70% of the information. Because if we actually wait till we have 90%, we're too late in making our decisions. So I just wanted to see what you think about that.
Well, so the whole idea is that we all need a way to work with and work through ambiguity, right? That's what the future is. That's what these high-stakes decisions are. And so that's what the area method is meant to do. It's meant to give you confidence and conviction that not only can you solve your high-stakes decisions, but that you can be uniquely solving for what constitutes a good outcome for you, and that you have thought about how your decision can fail and put safeguards in place that will not only let you know what are the signposts that show you it could be going awry, but also then what could you be doing to set up benchmarks to prevent it from failing that way.
That's right. So you're saying?
Do you do any post-mortem review of decisions you have made to either confirm or not?
So I think that's a great question. And of course, you want to continue to evaluate, right, how the decision is playing out. That's partially what the pre-mortem is having you do. It's giving you those markers that you want to be using to sort of see how the decision is playing out. But you also want to recognize that at any moment in time, you're only getting the balance sheet, right? You're only getting the snapshot. How is the decision today, right? So, whether you choose for yourself, when do you know that it constitutes a good outcome? Do you know it a month out? Do you know it 6 weeks out? Do you know it 6 years out, right? For John, one of the things was this incredible affirmation by identifying in relative and then in exploration of area, he was able to identify, as I had mentioned, other charities that were a little bit ahead of him. He was also able to identify who donated to those charities, right? So that he was able, when we finished the plan, to immediately take it to a much wider donor base that he had ever reached before. And so for him, he was able to figure out, wow, people really like this, and I have the plan 100% funded upon completion of the plan. So he could have said that's success, right? But then you also think about the fact that as he began to work with the government clinics, what did it look like? Did the populations in those areas actually show up, right? Because he was concerned that the government clinics had such a bad reputation and this terrible problem of absenteeism, where the person would sign in and say that the healthcare worker was there but wasn't actually there. Was he able to actually triangulate that problem with the pre-mortem? That's another signpost about whether or not he's succeeding. The number of people that show up, and then the number of lives that he's saving. That's another benchmark. So I think that what the area method does is it addresses not only the human behavior and social performance side of decision making, but also the evaluation and the metric side, so that you can think about what are the criteria that I am using to think about what success I'm actually trying to measure.
I think it's a brilliant question, Jose, and I think we don't reflect enough on decisions, and I think you speak a lot about mindfulness, and I think, you know, what women tend to do, and this is obviously an overgeneralization when I speak about women versus men, but, you know, I actually do a lot of research in that area, is they tend to reflect more on the decisions, the wrong decisions, than the right decisions, and I actually think it's equally important to reflect on understanding the process. In this case, you know, the area method that you use to come to the right decisions, because that builds so much more confidence and it enables you to redo that same kind of
We
process.
second guess ourselves all the time.
What is that?
We second guess ourselves, so,
Yeah.
so especially, so it's interesting you say that, because a core part of the area method and what these cheetah sheets are actually asking you to do during the strategic stops is to write down, what have you learned in this part of the phase? And so you're keeping what I call an area journal, and I think many of us have read in many places the utility of a journal. What I like about the area journal is not only does it prevent you from thesis creep, which are those pesky evolving hypotheses for why we're doing what we're doing at any given time, but the other thing is we're beginning to build the book of ourselves as a decision maker, right? So that we can look back, and not only can we see what we were thinking at the time, and that holds us to some of this accountability that you're talking about when we're thinking about the evaluation and the metrics that we're using by which to judge the success of the decision, but it also allows us to have somebody else repeat the process to see what we were doing. And the more that we learn about ourselves as decision makers, the more maybe we can heighten our awareness and potentially control for and counteract the cognitive biases that tend to get in our way. So not only do I recommend throughout what you're going to write down based on what you're going to do with the cheetah sheets, but I also recently put up on my website, which is areamethod.com, a web-based app which helps you identify what I call your problem solver profile. It takes you through a short series of quiz questions, and at the outcome, it categorizes you into one of 5 decision maker archetypes. It tells you then what is the strength of being that kind of an archetype, what are the potential blind spots, again, the major cognitive biases that may trip up that kind of a decision maker the most, and tells you a little bit about a historical figure who fits into that archetype and why the historical figure fits into that archetype. And then you can also use the app to begin in a rudimentary way to use parts of the area method to make your big decisions better. If you use this, fill out the evaluation at the end, or send me an email at CherylEinhorn@gmail.com. Tell me what you think about it, what works for you, what else you would like to see, because I'm in the process of collecting the information so that I can think about what it would look like to build it out in a more comprehensive way. I think it's useful to know what's our default as a decision maker in terms of the kind of archetype we are, with one caveat. We are all inconsistent decision makers. If we are faced with the same decision in 2 totally different situations, we may make that decision completely differently. based on the people we're dealing with, or the time of day it is, or
Exactly.
the environment that we're in. But understanding ourselves, what's that default for us? What's our automatic go-to as an archetype? I think that still has a lot of value, because that shows us what's the crutch for us? What's the natural default in our judgment for the kind of decision-making that we are?
So on that note, let me ask you the last question, because I do think there's very different kinds of decision makers, right? And from my perspective, this book is really timely, because if we look at, no matter on which side of the, the political side you are, when we look at the current environment, it's certainly politically charged, and a lot of decisions are made, it seems like, not always fact-based and sometimes emotional on both sides of the aisles. And so I would like to ask you, what would be your advice to the decision makers in the political arena on decision making? What can they learn from you?
So I think there's two main things that I would hope that our leaders think about. One is the perspective taking, and walking in somebody else's shoes, and that ability to develop empathy and understanding with the other people who are involved and impacted by the decision. And then the second thing is the cheetah pause, because as I was saying, we are all in this incredible rush to judgment. We don't formally teach decision making in our schools. We don't even systematically teach our family members how to do it. And yet there's really nothing, as I was saying, that is higher stakes than the decisions that we make. Can you imagine if every high school student, for instance, graduated not only with a degree from the school that he or she went to, but actually had a degree in some kind of a decision-making system, right? And actually, that's one of the most exciting projects I've been working on right now. There's a national not-for-profit called the Future Project that's in our nation's high schools, and I've been working with them to develop bringing area to high schools nationally. We just did a pilot program with students from Brooklyn and from Newark back in March, and we did a 3.5-hour boot camp to teach them parts of the area method. That's how I initially developed the app. I was thinking about where are teenagers, where is their attention, and as many of us know, it's on their phone, so that's how I decided to come up with a rendition of area on the phone. And at the end of the evaluation for all the students, 100% of them said that it was valuable, and 100% of them said they would recommend it to a friend. So I think that there's nothing that is higher stakes in our lives, and nothing that can give us greater meaning.
Yeah, there's a great video online about this,
On my
where the kids
website.
are speaking about this, and I'm actually really excited. And it's fascinating how I always think that decision making is one of the most important components to success, and that we are actually not teaching them. And the other thing that I feel is so important about this book is there's a humility about it, right? Because if we actually are aware that we have all these biases and that they are unconscious, we pause more and we check in more and we listen more.
One final question, which may be a bit counterintuitive, but where does intuition
Oh,
fit into
great question,
the
Mitchell.
formula?
So intuition is like the gut responses that we have, right? And sometimes the gut responses can be perfectly good. But again, you want to be checking your gut, right? I mean, some decisions we don't want to check it, we just want to go with it, we want to get out of the supermarket, or we want to get the kids in the car, whatever that is. But when we're faced with complex problems, we do want a way to have the time for thoughtful reflection so that we can come to a decision that not only has a high chance for succeeding, but that constitutes success for us.
You can put them next to each other as well.
You'd mentioned that just for time reasons, that you should do 7% of the research versus
She said
70.
70.
Jeff Bezos
Okay.
said, yeah, of Amazon, he is a little bit more credible than I. So he did say 70%.
Okay.
Yeah, no, 7 is shocking.
7%.
So that's maybe what her husband does now. So 70% versus 90%.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
I don't
makes
have a
more,
question.
makes more sense.
That makes a lot more sense.
Thank you for clarifying though, these are such important things because we don't want to walk away thinking that it's 7%, because now we might end up in many disasters, right? So thank you for asking. So I would just say, let's give Cheryl the time to sign books. Shall I bring them over here, Cheryl?
Well,
Is that easier?
I can come over
Yeah?
there, it's fine,
Yeah.
yeah, whatever is good.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.